Okay, so as we were saying, in
That
case that
sounds
didn't
better.
get picked up, a public hearing on the FY23 operating budget followed by a board work session. And that occurs annually at this stage in the process every year. And at the January 12th board meeting, I submitted my recommended budget to the board. And as you learned this evening, as Mr. Kyler stated earlier, we've received some additional information as it relates to state funding, and that's helpful, although not all of the clarity we'd like to have, and Mr. Hartlove and Mr. O'Neill will talk about that in just a minute. Next week is the next regular board meeting, February 9th, and at that meeting, you will vote on your FY23 budget request, which is then submitted to the county commissioners and to the public for additional feedback to return to us later this spring. The way we've structured things tonight is first we want to just provide a very brief overview to bring everybody up to sort of our current status and any updates we have. And then we'll take the time for anybody who signed up for public comment. I believe we have a couple of cards to make comments on the FY23 operating budget. And then after public comment, we'll immediately move right into our work session. So with the board's agreement, I'd like to go ahead and get us started. Good? Okay. And as we get ready to kick things off, I do want to just take a moment to thank Drew Sexton, obviously Mr. Hartlove, folks in his shop, Ms. Gaddis, and others who helped us put together, again, a citizen's guide to the budget. We're trying to be as transparent as possible in advertising information, how the process works, dates and times, et cetera. And so this is, we found this over the last few years very helpful in accomplishing that. So thanks to those folks who helped provide that information. Okay, Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you, Dr. Lockhart, and good evening, everyone. For the presentation tonight, we typically have this before the public hearing so that members of the public who wish to speak have the benefit of seeing any updates. Much of the slides that are in the presentation that have the expenditures and the revenue and then the reconciliation of them are slides you've seen before. So in the interest of time and to allow for you to have as much discussion as possible, we weren't going to spend a lot of time on those slides. Where we wanted to spend a little bit of time in the presentation having some discussion or some updates is with the changes that have occurred since the last meeting relative to state funding. So if you remember at your last meeting, we were waiting for the important time periods when the governor released his budget as required by the Constitution during the General Assembly. That occurred on the 19th. We began to receive some analysis, or at least we were aware of analysis that the Department of Legislative Services was presenting the next week, and then the State Department of Education released preliminary figures to the CFO, so Mr. Hartlove's peer group, on the 27th. And so what we do know is good news overall. We know that the amount of money we expect to receive in fiscal 23 from the state under the blueprint is about $10.2 million. And that, if you recall, we were trying to go with our most conservative best guess, or worst case if you prefer, scenario, and we were estimating $6.6 million in the earlier discussions we've had. We now know that that number is apparently going to be more like $10.2 million. We are optimistic, although there's some cautions coming up, but we're optimistic that with that amount of additional state funding, we should be able to, we believe we'll be able to meet all of our FY23 blueprint obligations. So all of the requirements in the first year of phasing in the blueprint, we hope that amount of funding would be adequate for. A couple of areas of caution. And the first one's not a surprise. We knew this was in the legislation, but during the Thornton years, under that formula that now goes away, there was always something called the Geographic Costs for Education Index, or GCEI, and some of the systems in Maryland receive funding in that block, and we have been fortunate to be one of the counties that receives GCEI funding. For FY23, that particular amount of funding will be $2.6 million. The bad news is that GCEI as a concept phases out in the second year of the blueprint. So beginning not the coming fiscal year, but FY24, there no longer will be GCEI. It doesn't exist. It sort of is being replaced by something called the Comparative Wage Index, and Carrol is not a county that qualifies for funding under the Comparative Wage Index. So we know that we're looking at our final year of GCI funding this coming year, and so there's a $2.6 million item that we'll continue to highlight for you as we move through the next fiscal year into fiscal year 24 preparation. Also, we're aware, and I don't know that maybe it's a good time to stop now and say, for everything else we're going to talk about, while it's nice to know the number and knowing that it's more rather than less funding is a very good thing to know, we still don't have the amount of clarity regarding the blueprint and what the requirements are going to be that we would really like to have. And I don't think that's anyone's fault. I don't think that there's someone or something to blame. It's just that this is very new and the governing bodies are still being set up, and the kind of documents that we think are going to be vital to ultimately understanding here are the exact requirements for every Board of Ed in Maryland, or for Carroll County schools specifically. That's not really known and available yet. People are still, there's a lot of wondering and speculation about that. One of the things that's happened in FY23 is that the state has placed a hold harmless on compensatory education funding. And that term, comp ed or compensatory ed, is the term that the state's used, at least as long as I've been working, for what we would call, in the bigger picture, Title I funds. That's sort of the state version of Title I for a sloppy definition. We and other systems, I think, across the state have seen a decline in participation, meaning the number of families who are filling out the Title I forms or the free and reduced meals forms for their students has declined. We have, I think we've said in the past, I think Mr. Hartlove has said in presentations, we believe that's because with the pandemic and the federal money that came, there was no longer everyone could get a free meal. Every student could get a free meal. So there's less of a need or an incentive for everyone to fill out those forms. But when it comes funding time, the net effect of that is you have a smaller population who fall into that category, and so funding would go down. So the state has placed a hold harmless in place for compensatory education for FY23. I'm still a little murky on those details. Chris might be more specific during your discussion, but that invites the conversation of, okay, what happens in FY24 and 25 and thereafter if there's a hold harmless for next year. So the two little areas of caution. And then all of the other areas, I'm not going to go through each one except to say that, the point of the blueprint in part is to identify very, very specific program needs, types of student populations or programs that need to be addressed specifically in public schools, and give them the financial support they need to meet the requirements of the state, and some of them are listed there. So we know under the new blueprint formula, we get funding in each of these areas, for instance. But what we don't know yet, and this is what I was referring to earlier, what we don't know yet is what restrictions come with that funding. So in other words, if your total funding is $10.2 million, but that $10.2 million breaks into categories like those listed, how much flexibility do you have to organize your budget? Or what requirements is the state going to impose when we get to the point of having comprehensive implementation plans for the blueprint? And just for one example, and this doesn't mean this will be true, just for the sake of a discussion, the kinds of things that we're not clear on that we wonder and worry about. Full-day pre-K. We know the goal is to ultimately phase in full-day pre-K. We know that the blueprint in theory has a public-private partnership of eligible slots for kids that fall into certain categories based on their family income. But we don't know in year one, when we receive the amount of funding that the state has allocated, what does that mean? Does that mean that they will have an expectation that we should be ramping up full-day K by a certain percentage in the first year? And if so, that may require things like space or staffing. And so if that turns out to be true, then whatever portion of funds you'll have to expend or we'll have to expend on your behalf to, say, add staffing, that then isn't funds available for something else such as employee compensation. That's kind of the real challenge here until there is greater clarity as the blueprint rolls out over time. So, it's good news overall, and I don't want to try to diminish that. It's still a little stressful to not know for sure what all of the requirements or restrictions might be. So that's kind of the update on the state budget as of now. I know we'll have lots of time for discussion later. At the local level, the superintendent requested, as you know, an additional $4 million in local ongoing revenue from the county. That's in his recommended budget that still sits before you. That would be $4 million over the number in the county 5-year plan. So as you inherit this budget or receive this budget for you to deliberate and ultimately adopt a request of your own next Wednesday to send to the county, that's still the local revenue number that's at work in all of the presentations or in the budget documents. So, as I said, these next several slides are slides you've seen before. The numbers have not changed, or if they've changed, it's insignificant in terms of the changes. So I don't want to spend a lot of time because I think you'll discuss these things later to the extent they have interest for you. But as you know, we had made some commitments. We've talked a lot about the commitments to the transportation reimbursement formula. That's still something that's out there, and we'll come back to that in terms of priorities later. Mr. Hartlove has covered all of these items in prior presentations, including costs of inflation, things that go up just to maintain the system as it exists, covering some losses in federal Title I, the eSmart grant pickup, and then the fact that the additional square footage at Career and Tech adds the need for a couple of custodians. One part of the blueprint that we can cost out is the requirement for salary add-on for teachers who possess national board certification. That starts on July 1st or with the next school year. And we just spent a lot of time talking about what those other blueprint requirements might be. And unfortunately, we still don't know for sure in many cases what those specific requirements might be. Employee compensation, which has to be negotiated with all of your 5 employee groups, remains something that's been identified as a priority for many years, going back even to the town halls that you held with Dr. Lockhart in his first year as superintendent. And then there's other priorities, some of those things that started being discussed in the town halls and have carried forward since then. We'll highlight some of those later, but those are possible expenditures. So with the changes in state revenue and still requesting the additional $4 million above the county plan in local ongoing revenue, that gets you to a total revenue increase of $20.6 million. Here's a summary of those items we just talked about a little bit in terms of anticipated or preliminary expenditures, and they total up to $6.8 million. And so then that leaves you, if you have those estimated revenue, that the sum of estimated revenue and the total expenditures, with an available balance of $13.8 million. And again, we spent a lot of time trying to say, pending whatever restrictions may come with the state money under the blueprint. So things that are not included would be other salary items for all of the employees in the system, those other blueprint requirements, whatever they each turn out to be. In addition to the $2.2 million that's in the superintendent's proposed budget, we've had a lot of conversation about other needs of the bus contractors, the bus drivers, bus assistants, so that's still something that's being discussed, and we assume it might be discussed this evening, and then other system priorities. And for the sake of the public's knowledge and interest, and then for your discussion later, Dr. Lockhart worked with us to come up with sort of a summary of what some of those other system needs and priorities might be. And certainly you may have others, and that's also part of a work session. Certainly members of the public, when they address you, may have other ideas as well that can be incorporated into the discussion. But what we did here under Dr. Lockhart's guidance was to try to go back to the town halls in fiscal year 20 for the fiscal year 21 preparation, budget preparation, and look at what were those items that were prioritized as system needs. Many of those carried forward as recently as your August 2021 meeting, so just a few months ago here when Chris provided a budget update, some of these things were addressed again. And so what we did here was just try to capture some of those bigger items and attach a cost estimate to them so that you would have a sense of what some of those priorities might be. And perhaps one of the biggest takeaways here would be, no matter how much revenue you receive, even if you get every dollar that you've requested or that the state says they might send, if these were to be priorities that you all shared, you quickly exceed even that amount of revenue. So a lot of your discussion might be sorting these things out, making sure that they're understood, and also the recognition that you may not get all of the revenue you asked for, and so then where would priorities fall? But even if you did, you're several $1 million short of priorities that you've identified over the years. And like I said, I'm trying to move as quickly as I can to get the speakers, but we can spend time on this if you wish during the work session. The next step, at least in terms of your part of the process, is next Wednesday at your business meeting, you'll adopt your recommended budget request, which then goes to the county staff and the county commissioners for their consideration as part of their overall budget process for the county. And then, not that we wouldn't provide updates throughout, but then the next time you would probably end up taking action on your budget would be sometime in May when final revenue numbers are known. The General Assembly will have concluded, the county presumably will have adopted their budget, and you'll have to sort of reconcile to whatever those final revenue figures would be. That would be much later, probably in the May timeline. And so with that, this would be where, I'll defer to Dr. Locker, but this would be normally where we would call on public speakers.
All right, so thank you, Mr. O'Neill. We'll keep the slides up and available so we can refer to all of that. But at this time, Ms. Battaglia, you have the cards. If you wouldn't mind calling the speakers, please, to the podium.
First speaker is Diane Grody.
Good evening. I'm representing the Carroll County School Bus Contractors Association. First of all, I'd like to say our association is appreciative of the recent hourly wage increase and recognition bonuses for our employees. Since health insurance and other benefits are not offered to our employees, these increases have been encouraging. Since the Joint Committee report on the transportation formula on October 13, our contractors have still prioritized 3 of the additional requests listed in this report. Originally, a 3% salary minimum increase was requested. However, we are requesting a 5% minimum for the fiscal year 23. Also, second, to adjust the per mile divisor for fuel from 7.0 to 6.5 mile per gallon to offset the DEF cost, which is increasing in price rapidly. There is no reimbursement component in our formula for this costly item. The third is a second matching administrative allotment in January to cover our overhead cost. Our financial consultants have advised us that the 20% fixed cost portion of the salary reimbursement is outdated due to the peak unemployment tax rates and increased business insurances, and should be at 25% now. Contractors who own the 500 series buses for athletic and field trip events have also faced a financial impact since 2020. We purchased these buses with no PVA. Only when the wheels are turning do we have income. With very limited and few field trips and athletic events since 2020, all subject to cancellations, the overhead expenses have far exceeded the income received since March of 2020. Those contractors required to replace buses for the fiscal year 23 school year are deciding if this is the time to downsize their fleets. We appreciate your consideration of our continued request. We value our business partnership with CCPS and the pride we have in operating our fleets for our students. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ms. McCullough.
Good evening. I am Theresa Basler-Mccullough, President of the Carroll County Education Association. As we approach this budget season, we remain optimistic that our superintendent and elected officials will recognize the compensation our educators have earned and deserve, especially during these challenging pandemic times. Please be mindful that we have a significant percentage of educators who are still 7 steps behind their number of years of service. Thankfully, due to the override of Governor Hogan's veto, the additional blueprint monies will be critical to address funding needs. We are confident that together we can make Carroll County Public Schools the preferred choice for newer and experienced educators. I have repeatedly shared my concerns about our workforce, and I take comfort in knowing that we are finally getting the resources our educators and students deserve. The most important factor at this time is to get to the table, and CCEA has put forth a request to start negotiations. Thank you.
Any other public speakers? All right, and that's everything.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Battaglia, and thank you for those who joined us this evening. So we're going to move into the work session. It's an opportunity, as we said, for the board to dialogue, ask questions, discuss priorities, review information Mr. O'Neill presented. And we'll have that, like I said, have that information available. We've also included a couple other pieces of information in the packets as it relates to some of the costs and some of the things that we've been talking about and presenting here in a little more detail. Certainly open to discussion, questions from the board. We'll do our best to provide feedback and answers to any specific questions you have. I think there are a couple of key items that I want to make sure that we address this evening as we look toward adoption next week. First is making sure the board this becomes the board's budget now, so the board's comfort level of the amount of local funding that I've recommended to you, the additional $4 million above the figure in the county plan. That'd be the first thing. We've talked for several years about additional supports in our schools, and it's been challenging because of competing priorities as it relates to compensation and other things. Obviously, none of us anticipated a pandemic. The same year we were doing those budget town halls, it was actually year number 2, we started to do those town halls and got a lot of great information from our community, from our teachers, from our stakeholders about what we needed in our schools to continue to support students. I was proud that we actually, in that budget year, added 6 special education positions. So we added positions for the first time to support schools in 10 years in Carroll County Public Schools. And so we still have needs, and in fact, I would say a lot of those school-based needs are even more prevalent. And you saw some of the things that we talked about, whether that was school psychologists, counselors, behavior therapists, those sorts of supports for our students. And so, I don't think we should abandon those, but at the same time, with so many unknowns and knowing we have, you saw the math, when we look at all those things that we think are important, it well exceeds what's likely to be available to us. So it is hard to make any final decisions when we don't have all of those factors included. And I think it's incumbent upon us to move forward with what we think is in the best interest of the system. I think we can justify that and validate that. We'll have an opportunity to meet with the commissioners at the end of February, and certainly in our joint meeting, and certainly ongoing throughout the budget process. And then we, as we always do every year, would have to make adjustments based on available funding, ultimately later in the spring. And as Ms. McCullough indicated, we'll be in negotiations during this time. We'll get that clarity that we're looking for with some of these other costs as well. So I'll stop there, just trying to paint a bigger, broader picture, and then open it up for discussion and feedback from the board.
Mr. Weaver?
Just a little clarification. You have a 10 million increase from state, correct?
Correct.
And you still need an additional 4 from the commissioners.
That is correct.
All right. Can you break that down as far as what you need for the pool, what you need for bus request, and what are other improvements?
Right. So I'll start, and then John, you can. So if you look at actually this slide right here, Commissioner Weaver, out of the 10 million that we're getting from the state, and again, we don't know exactly how much of that is restricted to those categories that Mr. O'Neill put out. In other words, that's great. We're happy to receive that, but we recognize that there are going to be strings, if you will, attached to much of those dollars. In fact, I would say most of it, to use for, you have to use it for this purpose, you have to use it for this purpose, because we're getting through the blueprint additional requirements on school systems. One of the reasons that we asked for additional funding from the county was, when you look at the math there, that's $7 million more than what's available. So we're not going to be able to do all those things, and we have to prioritize. Mr.
Dr. Locker, do you mind if I add something to that? Is the additional $4 million that we're also requesting from the county is kind of a makeup from last year. Last year, we had requested, so we missed a year of growth through the pandemic, and basically we're asking to be held harmless. And so that $4 million that we didn't get last year, and we basically had to make cuts or not make many of the improvements or not give the salary increases that we were hoping to give last year, we're basically requesting that $4 million as a hold harmless to catch us up to where we should be, because right now education is continuing to decline as a percentage of the county budget. So we're basically requesting that as a catch-up provision so that we can do these things that we weren't able to do last year.
Thank you.
And to add to that just a little bit, my opinion, what really made that hurt is essentially 2 years ago and a little bit last year, we lost ongoing money. So even if we get this now, we're still not catching up to where we would have been.
Maybe if we, Mr. Kyler, if it's appropriate, maybe we should step through these items again very quickly.
Sure.
So Chris, I think, has used the step amount as a benchmark before. So please understand, anybody who may be here or watching from a bargaining unit, this is not an attempt to negotiate at all. It's just to try to put some numbers out there for everyone to have a benchmark to use in your thinking. So if you wanted to give a step to all of your employees, that costs you $5.2 million. Sometimes we use what would a 1% cost of living increase be, and here, for the sake of being different and for the sake of saying probably most people might agree 2% is better than 1%, and that might not be what any union would think is acceptable, but that's, a 2% raise is more than we've had in a lot of the last 10 years. That's 4.4 or almost 4.5 million. Just half of that if you want to think in 1% increments, so 2.2% if you want to view it that way. There's an early requirement under the blueprint for teacher salaries, and that is that the salary scale for teachers had to have been increased by 10% between 2019 and the beginning of fiscal 25, so July 1, 24.
So if we just stop right there for a second. Those three things is approximately $15 million. And again, just doing some quick some quick math, our requests are we're going to have, obviously there's lots of things that we know our system needs and want to be able to do, but there to answer your question, Mr. Weaver, and to Ms. Savigny's point, we lost ground when we lost the ongoing funds previously, and I understand all the reasons around that, but that's also part of that request, the math of it and the fact that we've lost that ground.
Sure. And to finish the thought on that early blueprint salary requirement, it requires a 10% overall increase in that time period. Chris has done a lot of work with his team to try to do our best assessment of what we believe the difference still remains to get there. And so we've come up with, this would presume the 2% increase above. So if we did a 2% increase on top of that, an additional 4.7 million would be required to get there. It's not official or it's not required completely until another fiscal year, so there's some time here. And again, let me say for everybody, these three things are all subject to collective bargaining, so there's a whole nother process by which that has to be determined. And in case you're wondering, well, if it's subject to bargaining, what if we don't agree over that final number to get there for the first requirement? I think ultimately the Accountability Implementation Board will tell us what the correct answer is. However, in some ways, it's maybe a bit of an academic point because the next major blueprint requirement relative to teacher salary is to begin to phase to a starting teacher salary of $60,000 just a few years beyond. So whether we agree, on the exact percentage or the exact number, you're on a march towards a much higher number in the longer run anyway. We put in here, for the sake of this conversation, additional blueprint requirements. That gets to all of the things we've been talking about that Dr. Locker just went back over. Because we don't know and because we have some anxiety about what might ultimately be required of us, and more importantly, because we do not believe we're going to get that clear definitive guidance from the state until well into the spring, if not the summer. In an ideal world, it would be nice to have a little bit of money to then deal with some of those things that might show up in the state's approval of our implementation plan that maybe we weren't counting on, like additional pre-K staffing or space, or if you go back to any of those areas, wraparound services for students, those types of things. But I think this is going to be a rough first year until all those agencies get up and running and clear guidance starts coming out, and the plan that we ultimately bring for you for your approval when submission is known, understood, and approved. So we're saying it would be nice to have a placeholder. And another way to look at it that led us to this discussion point is pre-K phase-in is sort of like your cost in the first year, and then the next year, once the kids exist, you do receive state funding, but you have to kind of, at least that's been the progression so far under the blueprint phase, and you have to kind of front load that initial year of expansion, and then the state money chases it the year after. Positions funded by federal funds, as you know, we did use some of the ESSER funds to fund positions we believed were critical to manage the pandemic. Some of those are not included here in this estimate, and those are the quarantine success coaches. Presumably, in a full return to normal operations, we wouldn't maintain a virtual support position. But what is here are the teaching FTE we created to address the pandemic and address shifting class sizes. And so I think there's 20 FTE that are that are not an immediate concern, because federal funding will pay for them through fiscal 23. But at some point, if we want to maintain those, that's the price tag attached to those positions. And we may not only want to, but you may need to maintain those, because, as you all know, another ultimate requirement of the blueprint is how much time each teacher teaches. And it needs to be less perhaps than it currently is. And the only way that we're aware, well, one of the few ways that we're aware of to try to get there would be to add staffing. So would it make much sense in a couple of years when it's clear? Who knows? But would it make much sense to cut FTE that you'll be adding back in a couple of years under the blueprint anyway? We'll have to see about those things. You're well aware that a few years ago, as you identified priorities, you decided to forward fund a few positions using your fund balance. You actually, in one of your handouts, you have a listing of those positions that total up to the $817,000 as well. So that's out there as something in some year that has to be addressed, either to go away or to be continued or to be eventually accounted for with ongoing revenue. For the bus driver or bus contractor,
I just might add there, we did that in the year that we weren't getting ongoing funds. We knew we needed those positions. It's not a sustainable way to do it using one-time funds, but we needed the positions. Thank goodness we added those, in light of the pandemic. But that's just an example of, we had to figure out a way to try to do that, but that's not sustainable over time. You can't have one-time funding in perpetuity. So as John said, ultimately that either has to become part of our ongoing operating budget. That's why we're looking at additional dollars. Or sadly, they would have to get reprioritized somewhere.
And I think at the time, we said we would be able to assess the value of the positions so that we would know whether it would be positions that we'd like to carry on in the budget or not.
Yeah, and we do plan on in the future bringing that assessment back
Okay.
to you as we make permanent decisions about those.
For the bus contractor committee discussion, the number of 5,000 here it is again a placeholder. Once you made the commitment to increase the base salary by 5% now, that therefore then changes the $2.2 million figure in that category on fiscal year 23. Also, in a different way of looking at that figure, that also happens to represent roughly the amount of funds required to address the administrative allotment portion of what Ms. Grody and what Ms. Grody addressed tonight and what the contractors have been asking for. That doesn't mean that that's the final number. That just a little benchmark to give you some some framework for continuing that discussion. And then going all the way back to the, the priorities from the public input in the town halls, and those carried forward even up to an update that Chris gave in August. What we did was took some of those key priorities that haven't been met yet. If you think back, the one thing that we were able to do other than the 817 with fund balance, the one thing that we did permanently was added 6 special education FTE that next year. Those were the first position increases in your budget in a decade, permanent, ongoing funded positions. So we took those remaining items, or many of those remaining items, and costed them out using the updated numbers from Chris's August presentation and using more current budgetary numbers because they were first costed out in fiscal year 20, I think, or maybe fiscal year 21. And you have that 21, and you have that in your as a handout in your packet for reference as well. And with that, I promise to stop talking.
I have a couple questions. And let me just ask them, and then you guys decide who answers. You've mentioned it a little bit, but prior to COVID, we were planning and pretty optimistic about where we could head. We went to town hall meetings and heard about needs, and many of those needs you didn't even push to get to soon, but a bunch of those needs you did. I'd be curious to hear, of the priorities that were set back then, you know, do you feel like we've gotten 10% of them, 20% of them, or we have a long ways to go? And of course, and you mentioned the different hours that the new program's going to make teachers teach, which means you might need more classrooms, you might need, you know, more of a lot of things. We're still doing tutoring to catch up from before. And so that's kind of one set of questions. The second question, without scaring us, can you describe a little bit more about fund balance? Because we have planned for a lot of things that aren't in this because we've said we're going to use fund balance. And as the county knows, that can get touchy. You want to use it. You don't want to use too much, but you want to use it. And so just kind of those two thoughts.
So I'll start with the first one and then defer for fund balance, because I think you have the nitty-gritty of that. You know, we did a lot of work trying to work with our stakeholders, as we've said, identifying key priorities of positions in our schools to support teachers and students at the school level. Except for the ones that we put through fund balance, and that's listed there, the health services, school security, teacher specialist for substance abuse, the school psychologist, a couple of instructional technology and on-site technicians, which are not permanently in our budget. The only thing we were able to permanently add in that first year after the town hall were 6 special education positions. We have not received the funding to be able to achieve the goals of our negotiated agreement with our associations and keep moving forward with the prioritized school-based positions that we'd like to. So the short answer is we added 6 special education positions permanently to the budget. That was a big moment because, like we said, that's the first time in 10 years we've added positions like that to our budget. We went ahead and said, well, even though we didn't get the funding that we'd hoped for, we found a way to do it through fund balance. Not a sustainable long-term approach, but I think for the short term, it's been well worth it. And so, fund balance.
So, relative to fund balance, I'm looking at Chris to make sure I do have the bottom line correct. So the number we use for your fund balance, as a reminder, is always the number in your financial audit each September. So it, you know, obviously it changes throughout the year, or can change throughout the year at the end of the fiscal year, but that's always the official number. And I think we're at 15.4 million, so if that's not exact, that's approximate. You're still well within your policy for what your appropriate fund balance can be. I think the question Mr. Kyler's asking is sort of a little recap on what we've already possibly had you commit funding fund balance for. And I say possibly because depending on where we stand at the close of the fiscal year across the major categories of your budget, it may be that fund balance isn't required to pay for the full extent of all of these things. But the $1,000 bonuses that Dr. Lockard referenced at a recent meeting and you all unanimously endorsed, those had to be negotiated. There might still be some finalization, although some of those memoranda of understanding are complete and posted to the website for the public as well, by the way. That total package would come to $3.5 million of fund balance, more or less. The $420 or the $1,000 bus driver bonuses that you approved in November, I believe, and with that was a $500 bonus for bus assistance. That would come to $425,000. You approved the substitute, the add-ons to the daily substitute rates to try to help us push through the rest of this year in the pandemic conditions. Our best estimate for that was, I think, $760,000, maybe $750,000 for the rest of the year. And then we have a number of MOUs with different bargaining units that try to address the same thing, try to deal with the pandemic conditions to successfully serve students for the remainder of the year. Things like providing classroom coverage. I'm just going to rough estimate that collection of those MOUs with all the units that it'll come out somewhere between 1 million or 1.5 million. But again, in some cases that might be covered with transfers at the close of the fiscal year, and so the full impact might not be felt by the fund balance. But that's the kind of possible commitment you're at, and if you add that up, that's a lot of money. That's sizable. But the fund balance is in a healthy state, and quite frankly, the pandemic brought about some different things that we weren't really set up to address in other ways. And so those are the ways in which Dr. Locker's brought to you and you've approved to try to address it. So you'll have less fund balance, maybe significantly less fund balance next year than you did this year, but you'll still be in a very healthy range of fund balance based on your board policy, which is based on governmental accounting standards. Do you want to add, Chris?
That's good. Good answer. I'll say one last thing, too. If you recall, I'm going to go back to the first part of Mr. Kyler's question. As we were looking at ways in which we could, try to not only meet our negotiated, obligations, but also look at the needs of our schools in terms of staffing to support our students and staff at the school level. We also took the entire system through a zero-based budgeting exercise to try to find efficiencies wherever we could, and we were able to achieve that. I think that's part of how we were able to get those 6 positions worked in lieu of getting, the requested additional ongoing dollars that we really need.
More questions?
I know we're at a place where we do need more information as it relates to some of those blueprint obligations. And obviously, we haven't even had the chance to sit down with the commissioners yet. So I know it's still early.
John, can I go back and ask a couple of questions on some of the earlier slides? I know you had said that with the state budget update that we're expecting to get the 10.2 million versus the 6 million that we're originally thinking was sort of a worst case scenario.
Correct.
Right. The 2.6 million of the GCEI that goes away, does that effectively become like a structural imbalance next year? Like, so that.
So I hope not. So first of all, that's not a surprise, at least to Chris and me and Dr. Locker and other folks who, handle this kind of work every day. That's been clear from the time it was a bill that GCI would go away, and we didn't hold out a lot of hope that we would qualify under comparable wage, because for whatever reason, generally we don't do as well as other systems under any state formula. The hope has always been and remains that there would be enough new revenue in each successive year of the blueprint of Kerwin that it wouldn't create a structural deficit or a structural imbalance. And that remains the hope, at least for me. I'm sure you feel the same way. But the question would be, how much new revenue comes in '24 from the state, let's say 4 million, just for the sake of or 5, because it'd be about double, for the sake of a discussion. Well, the first half of that, the first 2.5 million of that new 5, if we get that in 24, is going to cover whatever's being funded with that allocation that used to come under GCEI, and that's, that's the struggle here. Compensatory ed, I used to, when we first got very preliminary numbers, I was concerned that might be a lot. Chris is telling me to calm down. It's probably like a few 100,000, not a million or more. I do think, I don't know what that buys you, but I do think that the state will recognize that that's a statewide issue that needs to be addressed. So if the federal government is going to continue to provide free meals, and a net effect of that or a side effect of that is declining farms enrollment, then probably in a more permanent way that's going to need to be addressed. But that's a hope, not a definitive I know that kind of thing. Or if they don't continue the free meals indefinitely, then I would assume numbers would go back up here and elsewhere as well. Did that answer what you were looking for?
It did. And so the 10 million that we're getting, or that we expect to get for FY23, that's ongoing funds, and the additional money that we talk about in future years will be over and above the 10 million of ongoing,
Yes.
right? So in FY24, we'll take another step towards completing the blueprint, and there will be additional funds to come along with those pieces.
Correct.
But we would expect that most of those will be earmarked as well.
Yes. Yes.
Well, while you're looking, and I think you might have just mentioned this too, but the Title I funding, we always seem to end up on the short end in Carroll County on a bunch of that stuff. Could that possibly be ongoing too? Or, I mean, we don't want to, I think, we don't want to give up our Title I schools. We don't want to change anything there. So are we going to expect to spend that much or maybe even more, or who knows?
You might be referring to the second bullet on this slide, the $1 million. So that's the federal Title I money, correct? Passing through.
Correct.
And I'll look at Chris for support, but to me, Mr. Kyler, that's the same problem, because farms numbers have been down here and everywhere.
Yes.
That's a problem, because we believe that's driven by the disincentive to fill out the forms. It's a bigger, well, I don't know that for sure, but I would assume it's a bigger problem for us here than other locations, because we had the lowest farms percentage in the first place. And so that decline in enrollment or participation in farms put us below a threshold that the federal government looks at to elevate or back off funding. So we didn't want to forego those. We didn't want to forgo those services to students in real time, and this is the way to cover that. Whether that becomes a permanent structural item for you to cover probably has a lot to do with what the ultimate decision is on how to count farms students in the future. I want to stop and ask him to see if he agrees with that.
I agree with all that. The other thing I remember in the discussions what we had back when this was the topic of the day was the census. I think the census also had something to do with that. And what this means is if this is a permanent reduction, you would fix it in this budget, and then it would be fixed going forward. What we're going to have to do is get a better handle, which we don't know yet, what's going to happen with the federal government. Some of that may be tied to farms. And if it's permanent, then you permanently fixed it. If we're fortunate and it's not as bad as this, we actually, this number potentially could go down a little bit. And then there's also some decisions, that we may need to make internally. We're doing things because we're getting federal dollars. We know we need to do a lot of those same things, but do we need to do all of them? Maybe when we're using local dollars, maybe we decide to back off of a few of the things that maybe we wouldn't normally do, but we're doing because we get federal dollars. So that's really, we put there, and you notice the words in there, up to, because we're really hoping that's a worst case scenario, is the up to the $1 million.
And I'm actually surprised at, not as many families filling out the forms. I mean, you would think because of COVID, the loss of income,
Well,
I think,
the tie, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
I was
Cindy.
just going to say, one of the issues was the timing of it. When the forms needed to be filled out, our students were not in school. They were at home. And so our staff really supports students and their families in getting out there and encouraging people to fill out the census forms and helping families who might need help doing that. And we just didn't have the access we normally have to families in order to support that process.
Right. And with regards to the free and reduced forms that you have to do every year, this is probably a nationwide problem, but it's definitely a statewide problem because the federal government is, as Mr. O'Neill was saying in the intro, right now, all lunches are free for all of our students, which is that's a phenomenal thing, but the incentive to fill the paperwork out is gone.
Yeah,
You don't get anything for filling the paperwork out, so people aren't filling the paperwork out.
Yeah, because it's already there.
Because they're getting the free meal that they would have gotten, they would have needed to fill the paperwork out to get in the past.
And to add to what Ms. McCabe just said, and it's not for lack of effort by many of our staff. A lot of people, Chris and Karen and Cindy's directors and principals in those schools and Mr. Wernick have worked tirelessly to try to figure out ways to be new and different in trying to get those forms turned in. It's just it matters more in Carroll with the lowest farms percentage in the first place than it does in other school systems, and it's a challenge.
And those forms are on our website, correct?
Yeah, it is. Over the last couple of years, we moved. It used to be a paper process. We've moved it to an online process. So it's definitely an electronic process.
Okay, so we just need to kind of get the word out to our families, like, even if you don't think you would qualify, even though we do have the free lunches and breakfasts for
Right.
everyone in the schools, fill them out, because it does help making sure we have the resources we need in our schools, federally funded.
Right. A big count that we have is our farms count, and if there's not the incentive, then it becomes a different game. We don't know really how that impacts behavior, other than we know less people are filling the forms out.
Now, do also, like, whether it be like the health department or other resources that we have in Carroll County, do they know of what families to kind of reach out to as well, those that might need free health insurance or anything of that magnitude, so that way we could tap into that a little bit and just try to get a hold of those families as well?
We do. There's a direct, when we get our free and reduced count, there's my understanding, and I'm not, in the details of this every day, but there's two ways of getting that information. One is direct certification, which is through these other programs that people get. So if you're getting, I'm probably not using the right terminology, but if you're getting part of I think it's TANF and these food stamps, these types of programs, we get a feed of who those folks are. So we know who those folks are. Those count in our account automatically. The folks that we don't get are the people that maybe either don't qualify for those programs or haven't applied for those programs. And we say, if you want your son or daughter to get a free or reduced meal, fill this paperwork out. And I know the qualifications are different for different programs also. So some of those folks we're already, what you're saying is we're already doing that. We do get, if you're getting other federal programs, you're involved in that, we get that feed. We know who those folks are, and we get those in our accounts. I think that's probably why we have some free and reduced meal people, because they didn't have to fill a form out.
Right.
So the folks that are not filling the forms, the folks that we need to fill the forms out are not.
And I want families to know, too, there's no shame in filling out those forms. And I think that's a lot of things, too, is that they're labeled, they feel there's this bias against them, because they need the help. That's why it's there. It's to help their families, to help their kids, so fill them out.
Mr. Hartlove, can you give us an understanding of, so the folks that automatically qualify, like you were saying, like if you can check certain boxes of
Right.
receiving, you get those lists of the folks that would automatically qualify. but
Right.
we're missing out on the percentage of folks that don't automatically qualify,
Right.
but would need to fill out the forms.
Right, is that-
What percentage of the farms, like, did we miss out on that because of people not applying versus the ones that automatically get enrolled?
I don't have our counts in front of me, but our counts are down, as they are statewide. But on a percentage basis, I don't have that information, but it's significant.
I can say, yeah, we just dipped under 5%. So 5% is the threshold for us as a system. And if I remember correctly, we were at 4 point something, very close to 5, but it was just under the threshold. So we didn't miss by much.
Okay, so if we hit the 5, does that mean the full million comes back?
Yes.
So how many kids are we talking about to get us from the 4.9 to the 5?
We would have to look and see how many students exactly. And the other piece we don't know at this time is when they're going to count that for us. So we don't know if next year in our farms count, if we get above 5%, if they'll change it, or if they're going to tell us that we have to now wait. Since we dropped under 5%, we may have to show that we're above 5% for so many years. That's usually what they like to see, is 3 years of being at 5 or more percent.
That's what my next question was going to be, is there a lag in that? But because, I mean, if we're really only 0.1% off, that's like 25 kids. We should be able to find a way to get those 25 kids in so that we can get to the threshold. But if there's a lag in the way they allow you to count it.
And that was part of our thinking of, we need to make sure we include this, so it doesn't catch us every year thinking, oh, we've caught up and there's some lag or some issue with,
And to be clear, we don't know that, none of us know that exact number sitting here tonight, but people do in the system. And like Mr. Wernick, the principals, I talked to one of the Title I principals who was literally going to people's homes with the form saying, please fill it out. So they're aware who those students are and have tried as many forms of outreach as they can.
And there certainly used to be some folks who certainly just filled those forms out right away and got them in. And, then if they would get close to the deadline and didn't have the forms turned in, you would just get a notice out, look, we need your form. Because by a certain date, if a new form hasn't been filled out, the child may not be eligible to receive free or reduced meals. That's the way it used to be. So it was an incentive for parents to fill those out. And if I remember correctly, it really was the youngest child who had the form filled out.
Right.
And then all of the siblings, whether they were in one of the upper elementary grades or middle or high, also qualified. So, it would be for the whole family. So again, it's just interesting to me to hear the dialogue here, since everyone is receiving the benefits of the program at this point.
Yeah. And I know Dr. Hart has communicated and worked on this with our Title I principals and Mr. Wernick, the elementary director. So they're well aware and working on all the issues that we're talking about here.
What about our homeless student population?
They qualify.
I was going to say, I knew necessarily some are not with their parent that they're supposed to be with. They might be with a different guardian or a foster type situation. Are those children making sure they're being included and making sure the paperwork is filled out properly as well to make sure they get the resources that they would need?
Yes, and they automatically get those resources.
Okay.
More?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the one thing that's keeping me up at night is thinking about the blueprint requirements in terms of not just the mandatory salary increases, but the change in the planning time, which is going to dramatically increase the number of FTEs that we're going to have to employ in order to meet those requirements, and if that's going to be appropriately recognized in the blueprint funding that comes our way. You'd kind of touched on it in terms of, we hired some additional FTEs in order to help with pandemic type situations with quarantines and illness and things like that. I'm worried about, like, so there's going to be this significantly ramped up need across the entire state for a lot more FTEs, and we're already struggling to fill the FTE positions that we need across the state. So I think that there's a little bit of non-realism. I mean, kind of fantasy, I guess I might even call it, in terms of how are we actually going to be able to fill those positions to meet the planning time requirements.
Yeah, that's something we've spent a lot of time talking about. We're desperate for, what that actually looks like and what the requirements are so we can start planning. We recognize it's out over many years that we have to get to a point, but to what you're saying, Ms. Savigny, we're in a time of shortage, and we're all going to be competing for the same resources around the state, and the sooner we have that information and can start to build that out and what it looks like over time, the better. So I also have some, anxiety with how many more are we going to have to add to hit whatever that mark is? And you better believe all our neighbors are going to be looking at that, and we're all going to be competing for limited resources.
And there are not that many going into the education field compared to what it was 20 years ago.
Yep.
It's way down.
And
So it's going to be a fight to fill these positions. And every county in the state of Maryland is going to be doing the same thing.
And it's everywhere. I mean, it's nationwide. It's every grocery store and department store in between too. I mean, they're all competing, wage wise and trying to grasp whoever they can, and that's gonna trickle down, and it just makes things more difficult.
Now, I think I heard Mr. O'Neill say, as he was presenting earlier, once that sort of time allotment is figured out or finalized, or we get the logistics, there could be other ways to meet that we don't even know about or have talked about yet. So that's the other thing. Like, okay, we could add more staff, or do we look at, and I don't even know what they would be, other creative ways to try to provide that additional time for teachers, but maybe not have to add 250 more FTE. I don't know. I'm trying to sort of think outside the box here a little bit and not completely lock us into that's the only way we're going to get there, because I know MSDE and other counties are all thinking about these same things, and perhaps when we do get the logistics, there will be options or alternate ways to meet whatever it is they put around that.
Hopefully so, and we'll know for sure at a point in time, because our plan will have to be approved or not. And the problem, especially in this first year, and when some of us, we've talked about this before, we're at a statewide conference where Dr. Kerwin himself spoke, and that question came up directly from two people in the audience. And he basically said, you have to hope that the philosophy behind all of this is right, in that once a starting teacher makes $60,000, and once the institutions of higher education align and sell it, then they will be there. But he also said the first couple of years might be rough. And the first year, to me, is really challenging, because the key dates that are coming up is that the AIB is supposed to present the comprehensive statewide plan for how this all unfolds by February 15th, and they have so far one staff person, a director, and she's already publicly saying, I don't know how we're supposed to get this done by February 15th, because it's just me.
Right, which is just about a week away.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the next key date, at least as the law is today, is that the State Department of Education takes that model comprehensive plan from the Accountability and Implementation Board, and by April 1st churns out or provides local school systems, here's the guidance for you to develop your plans, your comprehensive 10-year blueprint plan based on this guidance or this model from the AIB. And then we would have from April 1st to June 15th, I believe, to develop our CCPS plan, get it to you for approval, and send it to both the AIB and the MSDE for their, their review and approval or suggested edits, and then we'll figure out, okay, and I'm sure it'll be iterative. There will be changes over time as we learn things. I'm sure it's going to be reviewed at least annually, but at least we'll have some of this initial guidance. What are we supposed to do in the first year with pre-K? What are we supposed to do in the first year with college and career ready? TSI eventually phases into something else in Kerwin's or the blueprint. So what do the steps look like to get there? And in any of these categories, what do we need to do? And then a whole lot of the blueprint, and we've shared this in the blueprint updates we give at each board meeting, has to do with, it's called different things, but it basically comes down to wraparound services for students. And the thing that's really worried me from the very beginning is, and it goes back to the Comp Ed Title I conversation, when you look at our demographics, we're not going to qualify for any of those specific funding streams under the blueprint. As long as I work, we're not going to qualify in Carroll County for concentration of poverty grants or wraparound services grants. But I speculate that we're not going to be immune from the state telling us you still need to provide services like that in Carroll County. You don't get a free pass on those wraparound services. If there's any good news relative to that, it's that many of the priorities you long ago identified fall into those categories, but you've never been able to fund those priorities. So here we sit still talking about them.
Well, as we move forward, I think, you're giving a monthly update at the board meetings about what we know more about the blueprint funding and how we're going to need to address those things. I think we're going to have to keep a lot of that potential increased resource need in mind because we're going to have some, I'm anticipating that we're going to have some tough conversations about the additional FTE positions that we've built in. We've needed every single one of them this year to deal with quarantines and sicknesses and things like that. But, God willing, things kind of get a little bit better going forward. Next year, we wouldn't need all of those, but do we necessarily want to release them if we're going to turn around and need them again a year or two later?
Right.
So we would want to release them if we think that we can find other ways to fill those requirements.
Or if we think it would be that easy to hire 20 more teachers that we already have some other year.
Right.
Yeah, so it's all of these things.
But that's going to be
blending.
the tough conversation that we're going to have over the next couple months.
Yep.
Regarding full-day pre-K, and I know some of our schools, we did some additions to, not was kindergarten, but we have like some space for pre-Ks. So eventually, we're going to have to probably look at capital plans, what we might need to do for that. That includes adding space, if there is space to add, what we're going to, the cost of that, what's going to be covered, what won't be covered.
So the blueprint has nothing to do with capital.
Oh.
And one of those areas where the right hand may not really know what the left hand's doing at the state would be that issue. So if you engage with the IAC right now, the Interagency Commission on School Construction, those potentials are just sort of now coming onto their radar. Mr. Kyler, I think, alluded to space earlier. There's space for pre-K. Still a lot of uncertainty as to what those requirements are going to be, but there's certainly a need for space to make them happen. Depending on how do you solve the teacher time dilemma, that if that's a lot of FTE, or even if that's some FTE, that also could mean space, or at least a desire for space, because more teachers doesn't mean there's suddenly more physical classrooms. So where are they going to teach? Or at best, they might be very unhappy new teachers who are rotating throughout. There's not a capital. The capital aspect of Kerwin, of the blueprint, has not been thought out yet. And
Now,
so, yeah.
is many of our pre-Ks, they're half day.
Mm-hmm.
Are much of those like at capacity?
I don't know. I think
We probably at capacity for what we would say for pre-K, which is about between 14 and 20.
Yeah, so having a full class is kind of impossible to do, combining it morning and afternoon.
Right, yeah, we wouldn't be able to combine morning and afternoon.
And this is an item in the report for your next meeting for the blueprint update. Mr. Wernick, who chairs that committee for us, can speak to it. But just in broad terms, what the blueprint requires is that all students who meet a certain family income level, who are 4-year-old and some 3-year-old, are eligible students, or eligible slots, and that through a phase-in over time, over a few years, you and private providers have to have available slots for those eligible students. It doesn't mean that every eligible student will show up or take advantage of it, but it's built on a theory of a 50-50 partnership. But something that's long been raised, even during the Kerwin Commission, and seems to be bearing out, and Steve Wernick can speak to the report we've already filed from Carrol. There doesn't seem to be that kind of capacity among private providers to ever get to anything close to a 50-50% partnership. And so then what happens? When the General Assembly has to take another look at that, does that become your entire burden as a Board of Ed, or do they wash that out in a different way in future versions of the law? So that's a huge unknown.
Yep.
Space, staffing requirements, transportation. I guess Mr. Hardesty's back there. Transportation. There's a lot of moving parts to that the Kerwin Commission didn't address. They were addressing sort of the philosophical basis of educating kids, not, okay, let's have a capital conversation.
Yeah, that's going to be fun.
Anything else?
So hearing nothing else, board members, I will bring back, I didn't hear any recommended changes, so we'll bring back for your conversation and adoption at the next week's board meeting, the FY2023 budget.
Is there, so we'll see that at next month's board meeting, and it basically is going to be our request to the county. Is there any additional documentation that we would need to provide to the county, Commissioner Weaver, in order to back up the additional $4 million request that we're making? We want to make sure that it's abundantly clear why we're asking for the $4 million, and it's not that we're asking for additional, it's basically we're trying to catch ourselves up from what was not provided in the previous years. So, like, what kind of backup do we need to provide to the commissioners to kind of make our case?
So we can have the existing documentation you have here, but also don't forget, we have opportunity to sit down with the commissioners and have that conversation to demonstrate that need that we've talked about this evening as well.
They also typically hold what they call agency hearings, where we get a chance to present directly to them on their dais as well, with the rationale behind the request.
Good. Is anything else you guys want to cover tonight? Board members, anything else? We don't need a motion, do we? Are we done?
Yeah, our budget work session is concluded. Thank you all
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
You.